Hello everyone, I'm Julie Manoharan, and on behalf of the Wild Act team, thanks so much for coming out this morning. Many of us know that these well-known species are in need of protection, but other, lesser-known animals are also threatened. And the habitats that support this diverse array of life are central to maintaining healthy ecosystems. Vital species and habitats are threatened by the growing human population and our demand for resources and land. In April of this year, Senator John Barrasso introduced the Wildlife Innovation and Longevity Driver Act, or the WILD Act, with the goal of preserving global biodiversity and protecting wildlife. The Act does this through 4 separate provisions. The Theodore Roosevelt Genius Prizes award 5 cash prizes for innovative technologies. The reauthorization of the Multinational Species Conservation Act protects 5 specific species groups. The reauthorization of the Partners for Fish and Wildlife Act creates partnerships with private landowners to protect habitats. And the amendment to the Fish and Wildlife Coordination Act develops strategic plans for managing invasive species. These provisions work in a variety of combinations to tackle the 3 main problems addressed in the WILD Act, which are wildlife poaching and trafficking, habitat loss, and invasive species. I'm going to talk through examples of these 3 problems and how one of the provision applies to each, with an emphasis on solutions, any associated controversies, and how to measure success of the provisions. The first problem addressed by the WILD Act is poaching and trafficking. And one of the ways to mitigate poaching and trafficking is to fund conservation efforts that target specific species that are often targeted by poachers. The WILD Act does this through the Multinational Species Conservation Acts. These Sumatran rhinos are poached in Bukit Barisan Selatan and Way Kambas National Parks in Sumatra, Indonesia. And their horns are trafficked around the world for use in traditional medicine and as a symbol of wealth. Poaching of these rhinos has decimated their populations, and over the last 20 years, their numbers have dropped by over 50%, leaving fewer than 100 of these animals left alive today. In an effort to curb poaching in these parks, the parks are receiving funding from the Multinational Species Conservation Act to create these RPUs, or Rhino Protection Units. These are groups made up of local community members and national park guards, and they patrol the parks in order to do things like deactivate poaching traps, apprehend poachers who they actually encounter in the parks, and investigate crime scenes where poaching has already occurred. The RPUs have been pretty successful, and over the last 7 years, there have been no reported incidents of Sumatran rhino poaching in these 2 parks. So this metric is specific to this particular project, but measuring the success of specific outputs or provisions within the bill is an attainable way to measure success. Measuring the WILD Act overall is a little bit more complicated, and I'll talk about that later. That being said, this solution was not without controversy because it can displace communities who are living on areas that become protected. So for example, in 1982, when Bukit Barisan Selatan National Park was established, the government underwent an intensive eviction campaign so that communities who were living on the park were forced to leave their homes and resettle elsewhere. These women are examples of people who once lived on the park and were forced to move elsewhere. The second problem addressed by the WILD Act is habitat loss. And one of the ways to address habitat loss is by funding technological innovation that aid in mitigation strategies. The WILD Act does this through the Theodore Roosevelt Genius Prizes. Habitat loss broadly can be broken down into 3 major categories: destruction, fragmentation, and degradation. In the same parks that I spoke about earlier, natural forest habitat is being destroyed and fragmented by illegal logging, which is a major industry in Indonesia. To try to curb this loss of habitat, rangers are using SMART, the Spatial Monitoring and Reporting tool, which is a free software that allows them to aggregate and analyze information about where illegal activity is happening in the parks. So for example, this ranger is able to use his mobile device, which has the SMART software downloaded onto it, in order to record things like sightings of illegal logging, newly deforested lands, and visits to logging sites. Over time, that information can be aggregated to create images like this one, which they show where the illegal activity is happening, those red dots, and they provide insight into where rangers can patrol in the future. So SMART has largely been successful in creating a metric. In its first year of implementation, it helped rangers record over 1,500 incidents of illegal logging. And from that baseline number, the rangers can better understand how illegal logging rates are changing over time. The Theodore Roosevelt Genius Prizes aim to promote technologies like SMART in order to preserve wildlife and biodiversity worldwide. So again, this solution had its controversies because people in the park also make a living off of the logging. So when patrol increases, those folks are forced to find income through other means. The last problem addressed by the Wild Act is invasive species, which can be managed through drawing from expertise from multiple stakeholders in order to create strategic plans for management. The Wild Act does this through two of its provisions: the reauthorization of the Partners for Fish and Wildlife Program and the amendment to the Fish and Wildlife Coordination Act. So invasive species have a number of negative consequences, including ecological harm, economic harm, and harm to human health. The Shiawassee National Wildlife Refuge in Michigan suffered from serious ecological harm when it was overrun by a variety of invasive species, including this purple loosestrife, which is actually the same flower that you saw in the previous sort of striking image on the last slide. This loosestrife crowds out native grasses and diminishes the number of potential nesting sites for native wildlife and degrades the habitat overall. In an effort to manage the loosestrife, the park released over 100,000 of these Gallerusella beetles, which preferentially feed on the loosestrife and decrease its populations. In addition, the park received funding from the Partners for Fish and Wildlife Act, which allowed them to partner with nearby private landowners so that mitigation and prevention of the reestablishment of the loosestrife was possible not only within the refuge, but also in the privately held lands around the refuge. Loosestrife is actually a broader problem, though, across much of the northern United States, so a more comprehensive management plan is probably needed. And the amendment to the Fish and Wildlife Coordination Act may be able to provide that. Among other things, what this amendment would do is require the Secretary of the Interior, who oversees all national wildlife refuges, to work with the governor of Michigan, where this refuge is, to develop a strategic plan for managing the loosestrife. And then that plan would be implemented in collaboration with local governments and local NGOs in order to create a more comprehensive, multi-tiered strategy for combating invasive species like loosestrife. The efforts of the Partners program were quite successful. You can see that in 1994, this field is covered in loosestrife, and by 1999, after the beetles had been released and the Partner program funding was implemented, there's very little loosestrife, native species richness was increased, and biodiversity richness was increased as well. But again, the release of biological control agents, or these non-native species that are aimed at managing invasive species, is controversial. Scientists can study a range of effects that an introduced species will have on an environment, but it's very difficult to understand all of the different effects. So there's always the possibility for unintended negative consequences. So I've spoken about some of the ways in which the Wild Act can be applied, and I've talked about ways that those specific projects can be measured in terms of success. But if the Wild Act is adopted, how can we understand the success of the Act overall? It's difficult because success will come in a variety of forms, both under the three problems, but also within the three provisions and within the projects and programs that are funded by those four provisions. And what's more, the Wild Act's goal is to preserve global biodiversity, which is something that can only be understood over incredibly long timescales. So one way to understand progress is by setting meaningful milestones or predetermined markers of success on the path toward our final outcome of preserving global biodiversity. So if we think about our Sumatran rhino example, we can talk about our outputs, which are some of the things that I talked about related to specific projects. And then we can think about milestones, so goal numbers of rhinos that we would want in 5 or 20 or 50 years. And then we can think about our progress toward that final outcome of a minimum population of 2,000 rhinos, at which point population biologists believe that Sumatran rhinos will have become sustainable or have a sustainable population. So there are definitely some barriers to implementing the Wild Act, but it's also possible that the four provisions will take some steps toward preserving biodiversity and protecting wildlife. With that, I would love to thank the wonderful Wild Act team and our incredible advisor, Dr. Robert A. Cook, and I can take your questions.
Great presentation. I just had a question. The 3 goals of the Wild Act, habitat loss, wildlife poaching, and invasive species, were those outlined by the act itself, or is that something that your guys' team identified?
It's something that we sort of drew out of the bill based on the goals that each of the provisions talks about a lot. It's not specifically listed in the bill.
Okay, thank you.
Great.
I'll take it.